What if I told you that surviving in an icy desert without matches or a lighter is easier than it seems to modern man? Imagine an endless snow-covered plain where the wind knocks you off your feet and the temperature drops to deadly levels. In such conditions, even the most experienced hiker risks dying within the first day without a source of heat. But for the indigenous peoples of North America, this harsh reality was not an extreme situation, but their normal home. They did not fight against the elements, but knew how to find hidden resources where we see only emptiness and cold. Their methods of obtaining fire were so perfect that they worked even in heavy rain and thick snowstorms. This knowledge was passed down from generation to generation, becoming the key to the survival of entire peoples for centuries. Watch the video to the end, and you will learn how a simple mushroom could keep a fire burning for weeks, and what secret ingredient allowed them to light a flame even from wet wood. What if everything you've been taught about the physics of combustion is missing the most important element? For the indigenous peoples of America, fire was never just a chemical reaction of oxidation that produced heat and light. They treated the flame as a living being that demanded respect, care, and constant attention. This attitude shaped a completely different approach to building a fire, which was incomprehensible to the first European colonists. Fire was considered a sacred gift, a mediator between the world of humans and higher powers, warming not only the body but also the spirit. In the culture of many tribes, there were special firekeepers whose task was to prevent the flame from going out under any circumstances. These people possessed a vast amount of knowledge about the properties of wood, winds, and air humidity. They could predict the behavior of fire based solely on the color of the smoke or the crackling of the logs. For them, building a fire was not a technical task, but a ritual of inviting an important guest into their home. If you treat fire with respect, it will warm you. But if you are careless, it can destroy everything. Understanding the character of fire allowed Native Americans to build fires in places where it seemed physically impossible. They knew that fire, like any living thing, needs to breathe, so they masterfully controlled air currents. Even in a strong storm, they knew how to create conditions so that the wind would not blow out the flame, but on the contrary, fan it. This required a deep understanding of aerodynamics, even though they did not have such scientific terms. Observation replaced physics textbooks for them, and the experience of their ancestors served as the best instruction manual. It is important to note that preparations for making a fire began long before the first frosts hit. The Indians constantly collected dry materials during their travels, never passing by valuable tinder. Their travel bags always contained supplies of dry bark, moss, or plant fluff. This was a habit that had become automatic, because at a critical moment, it would be too late to look for fuel under the snow. Survival depended on foresight and the ability to think one step ahead. The philosophy of fire also forbade its desecration with garbage or filth. Only clean wood, grass, or special offerings were placed in the fire, which also made practical sense. Clean fuel burned more evenly, produced less acrid smoke, and gave off more heat. This was critically important in the confined spaces of winter dwellings, where poor ventilation could lead to carbon monoxide poisoning. Thus, sacred rules directly ensured the safety and health of people. Interestingly, each type of wood was assigned its own character and purpose, depending on its burning properties. Hardwoods were valued for their long-lasting and hot coals, suitable for heating homes at night. Soft and resinous woods were used for quick ignition and bright light, necessary for short-term tasks. Fire masters knew hundreds of combinations of wood for different weather conditions and purposes. A mistake in choosing fuel could cost the tribe a night in the cold, which no one could allow. Fire also served as the center of social life, bringing people together around it on long winter evenings. Important decisions were made around the hearth, legends were told, and the wisdom of the elders was passed on. It was a place where bonds within the community were strengthened and collective memory was formed. Without fire, the social structure of the tribe would have been severely tested by the cold and darkness. That is why the art of making fire was one of the first skills that every member of the community learned. Even the methods of extinguishing a fire were strictly regulated and imbued with the meaning of conserving resources. Embers were often not doused with water, but carefully covered with earth or ash to preserve their heat until morning. This allowed the flame to be quickly revived the next day without having to obtain a spark again. Saving energy and time was a crucial aspect of life in the wild. The ability to put the fire to sleep was as important as the ability to wake it up. This deep, almost mystical understanding of the nature of fire gave the Indians an advantage over the elements. They did not fight the cold, but negotiated with it, using fire as a reliable ally and protector. It was a harmony based on knowledge, respect, and centuries of survival experience. Modern man often sees fire as merely a tool, overlooking its living essence. I would be very interested to hear your point of view. What do you think about this personification of natural phenomena? Write about it in the comments. Want to know a secret that will change your perception of the forest? When it's pouring rain or there's a meter of snow on the ground, it seems impossible to find dry fuel. All the branches are saturated with moisture, the tree trunks are covered with ice, and the ground has turned into a swamp. However, for the indigenous people of North America, even in such weather, the forest remained full of dry resources. The secret was knowing where to look and what to look for in this wet realm. One of the most important treasures for kindling a fire was birch bark, which was called the Queen of Tinder. Birch bark contains a huge amount of natural oils that repel water and burn beautifully. Even if the trunk of a birch tree was wet on the outside or rotting in a swamp, the inside of the bark remained dry and ready to ignite. It was enough to remove the upper wet layer with a knife or hands to get to the paper-like layers. Birch bark ignited at the slightest spark, producing a hot and steady flame. The Indians also knew that dry wood should be sought not on the ground, but in the air among the branches. The lower dry branches of coniferous trees, such as spruce or pine, were often protected from rain by the dense canopy above. These thin twigs, called cobwebs, dried out in the wind and remained brittle even in wet weather. They served as ideal kindling, which instantly caught fire from birch bark. Collecting such air fuel was a quick and effective way to obtain the basis for a fire. Another hidden source of dry material was the hollows of old trees and crevices in rocks. Inside dead but upright trunks, dry wood dust was often preserved, protected from precipitation. This tinder could be easily extracted and used as an excellent kindling, capable of smoldering and flaring into a flame. Such natural hiding places were known to experienced trackers, who noted them during their hunts. Knowledge of the terrain turned the forest into a map of fuel depots. The resinous stumps of coniferous trees were a real gift for anyone who wanted to start a fire in the rain. The resin, or sap, concentrated in the roots and base of the stump, impregnating the wood and making it waterproof. Such resinous wood chips, known as smolyak or fatwood, burned brightly and for a long time unaffected by moisture. The Indians specifically sought out old stumps, broke off pieces of them, and carried them with them as an inviolable supply. It was the best means of quickly starting a fire in a critical situation. Particular attention was paid to finding tinder fungi growing on the trunks of birch and other deciduous trees. The inner flesh of these mushrooms, if properly prepared and dried, turned into a material capable of catching the faintest spark. Tinder fungus could smolder for hours, keeping the fire going, or serve as an excellent initiator of flame when rubbed together. Harvesting these mushrooms was an important part of preparing for the winter season. Each type of tinder fungus had its own burning characteristics, known to the masters. In winter, when snow covered everything around, the Indians paid attention to the dried stems of tall plants sticking out above the snowdrifts. Inside the stems of wormwood, goldenrod, or cattail, dry pith or fluff often remained. These plant fibers were gathered into bundles and used as the most delicate tinder, which ignited instantly. Collecting such material required patience, but in the snowy desert, it was a reliable way to stay warm. Nature provided resources even when it seemed that everything was asleep. Moss was also used, which could be found on tree trunks on the leeward side or under overhanging rocks. Dry moss, especially the types known as beard moss, hanging from branches, was perfect for creating a kindling nest. It was mixed with thin birch bark and dry grass to create a voluminous lump into which a piece of charcoal was placed. The ability to make the right mixture for kindling was a real art. The quality of this nest determined whether the spark would ignite into a full flame. Rotten wood, or nilushki, also had its use in the process of obtaining fire. Absolutely dry Nilushka, found inside a broken trunk, worked like a sponge for sparks, beginning to smolder at the slightest contact. It did not produce an open flame immediately, but it allowed the heat to be reliably fixed and fanned. Rotten wood was often used in combination with flint or friction. This was an intermediate but important stage in the creation of a fire. Native Americans knew how to read the forest, seeing opportunities where ordinary people saw only obstacles and dampness. Their eyes were trained to notice the slightest signs of dryness, the color of the bark, the slope of the tree, the density of the crown. This knowledge allowed them to feel confident in any part of the forest and in any weather. The forest was not a hostile environment for them, but a storehouse full of hidden resources. In the next chapter, you will learn about a method that allowed them to avoid having to make fire from scratch every time. Are you ready to learn a secret that will change your life in the wild? The most reliable way to get fire in bad weather is not to start it from scratch in the rain and wind. The nomadic peoples of the prairies and forests possessed a unique technology for preserving fire, which allowed them to carry it over great distances. This method was a real revolution, eliminating the need to spend energy every evening rubbing sticks together to produce sparks. They literally carried fire with them, like a precious talisman hidden in a secure container. This technology was often based on specially treated tinder fungi or dense growths on trees. The internal structure of such a fungus resembles a dense sponge that can smolder slowly without producing an open flame or burning too quickly. A smoldering ember placed inside a large piece of tinder fungus could last for days, slowly eating the fungus from the inside. It was a natural analog of a carbon battery that stored thermal energy. The main thing was to choose the right size of fungus and ensure minimal airflow. Special cases were made from the horns of large ungulates or mollusk shells to transport this eternal fire. Horn, being a dense and non-combustible material, was ideal for creating an airtight container. The inside of the horn was lined with a layer of moist clay or sand to prevent the walls from overheating from the smoldering contents. Smoldering tinder or coals were placed in such a container, and the opening was tightly closed with a wooden plug with a small hole for breathing. Just enough air was allowed in so that the coals did not go out, but did not flare up into flames. In forest regions, containers rolled from thick birch bark or hollowed out from raw wood were often used instead of horns. These containers were also filled with ash and wood shavings, in the center of which the precious heat was hidden. The ashes served as an excellent heat insulator, preventing the heat from escaping and burning the hands of the carrier. A person could walk with such a container on their belt all day long, and no one would guess that they had fire with them. In the evening, it was enough to take out the smoldering coal and fan it into the prepared kindling. This practice required great skill and constant monitoring of the portable hearth. The keeper of the fire had to periodically check whether the coal had gone out and whether the tinder had burned too much. If the coal began to die out, it had to be carefully fed with a fresh piece of tinder or wood dust. It was a responsibility comparable to caring for a child, because losing the fire during a winter crossing could be fatal. Knowledge of how to feed a portable fire was passed down from older to younger generations. Interestingly, this method allowed you to instantly build a fire even during a short rest stop. There was no need to waste time preparing a bow for friction or searching for dry stones. Hunters could quickly boil herbal tea or warm their hands using ready-made charcoal. This gave them a huge tactical advantage and saved precious energy. The speed of obtaining heat was a key factor in comfort and survival. There were also simpler methods of carrying fire over short distances, such as fire torches. A tightly twisted bundle of cedar or juniper bark could smolder very slowly, like a giant cigarette. The traveler simply carried such a smoldering bundle in his hand, waving it from time to time to maintain the heat. This method was good for transitions between nearby camps, but required protection from strong winds and precipitation. However, it was accessible to everyone and did not require the manufacture of complex containers. Carrying fire also had a deep symbolic meaning of continuity and connection to home. The fire lit in a new place was the sun of the fire from the previous campsite, maintaining a continuous chain of warmth. This created a sense of stability and home comfort, even in the wildest and most unfamiliar places. People felt that a part of their home was always traveling with them, Fire was the connecting thread between past and future camps. The use of tinder, fungi, and airtight containers demonstrates a deep understanding of the chemistry of combustion. The Indians empirically discovered how limiting oxygen slows down the oxidation reaction. They invented slow-burning technology thousands of years before the advent of modern coal heaters. It was a high technology of the Stone Age, perfectly adapted to the needs of nomadic life. Thus, portable fire was one of the main secrets to successfully settling cold territories. It allowed people to be mobile and independent of the vagaries of the weather when obtaining sparks. In a world where matches did not yet exist, the ability to preserve and carry fire was valued more than gold. Like this if you are amazed by the ingenuity of ancient survivalists. Guess what happened next when the icy wind reached hurricane force and a fire had to be lit right on the open plain? A normal fire in such conditions would simply be blown out or burn out in a matter of minutes without providing any heat. The indigenous peoples of the Great Plains developed unique engineering solutions to protect the fire from the wind. They understood that it was useless to fight the wind. They had to learn to control the air currents. This is how the famous Dakota fire pits and other hidden methods of building fires came about. The Dakota fire pit technology consisted of a system of 2 pits connected by an underground tunnel. A fire was lit in the main pit, while the second, smaller pit served as an air duct located on the windward side. The wind forced air into the tunnel, creating a powerful draft, similar to a blacksmith's bellows, directly to the base of the flame. The fire burned very hot and clean, with virtually no smoke, as the fuel burned completely. At the same time, the flame itself was below ground level, reliably protected from gusts of wind. This design also had an important camouflaging significance in the context of intertribal conflicts. The fire in the pit was not visible from a distance, especially at night, which allowed food to be cooked secretly. The light from the flames went straight up or was absorbed by the walls of the pit, without revealing the location of the camp. In addition, the ground around the hearth heated up, serving as an excellent heat accumulator for people sitting nearby. After the fire burned out, the pit could be quickly filled in, leaving no traces of the camp. On the surface of the ground, where it was impossible to dig due to the frozen soil, a system of windbreaks and reflectors was used. The Indians built semicircular walls of stones, logs, or dense snow on the windward side. These screens not only blocked the wind, but also created a low-pressure zone around the fire where the flames burned evenly. It was important to calculate the distance correctly so that air turbulence did not blow smoke into the faces of those sitting around the fire. Experience allowed them to find the perfect balance between protection and ventilation. A special skill was required to maintain the fire inside a teepee, the traditional dwelling of the Plains tribes. The teepee's design included special smoke vents at the top of the cone, which were controlled by long poles. The inhabitants turned these valves according to the wind, creating the necessary draft to draw the smoke outside. It was a dynamic ventilation system that required constant adjustment depending on the weather. The slightest mistake could result in the dwelling filling with acrid smoke. In forested regions, massive log reflectors were used, placed behind the fire. The wall of logs reflected the radiant heat of the fire back to the sleeping people, creating a heat trap effect. This allowed them to sleep warm even at very low temperatures with only a small fire. The reflector also worked as a dryer for firewood and clothing, making efficient use of every joule of energy. It was a simple but extremely effective way to increase the efficiency of an open hearth. When building a fire in deep snow, there was a danger that the fire would melt the snow and fall into a water pit. To avoid this, special platforms were built from wet logs or thick branches. The fire was lit on this platform, which burned slowly but kept the coals above the level of the meltwater. This floating structure allowed people to cook food and keep warm without fear of the fire going out in a puddle. The Indians also knew how to use the natural terrain to protect the fire. They chose places in hollows, behind rocky outcrops, or in thickets of shrubs. They never set up camp on top of a hill or in an open field if there was even the slightest possibility of finding shelter. The ability to fit a camp into the landscape was part of their survival strategy. Nature itself suggested the best places. One only had to be able to see them. Smoke control was another important task of hearth architecture. The use of dry branches of certain tree species minimized the amount of smoke during the day. In wet weather, when smoke was unavoidable, they tried to disperse it with the help of special canopies. Living in harmony with fire required constant engineering solutions. All these methods show that Native Americans were outstanding practitioners of aerodynamics and thermal engineering. They did not have formulas, but they had thousands of years of trial and error experience, which became entrenched in tradition. Their hearths were not just piles of burning wood, but complex technical structures. Do you think you could build a Dakota fire pit with only simple tools? Finding firewood in the forest is not a problem, but what about the people who lived in the endless expanses of the Great Plains, where trees grow only in narrow strips along rare rivers? Tribal migrations often took them hundreds of kilometers into the open steppe, where there were no branches or dry wood. In these conditions, the indigenous peoples found an amazing and inexhaustible source of fuel that was literally at their feet. This fuel was the waste products of bison, which covered the prairies in abundance. Sun and wind-dried bison dung, delicately referred to as steppe coal or meadow chips, was an ideal fuel. Unlike fresh dung, it did not emit an unpleasant odor when burned and produced an even hot fire similar to burning peat. Gathering this fuel was the responsibility of women and children, who collected it in huge quantities during camp stops. The chips were stored in special bags or used immediately to create cozy, smoldering fires. This fuel was renewable and available all year round, even in winter if you knew where to dig under the snow. The secret to using steppe coal lay in building the fire correctly and ensuring access to oxygen. The chips were stacked on their edges or in a teepee shape so that air could circulate freely between them. Such a fire burned slowly, but then gave off very steady heat, ideal for simmering meat or heating a teepee. The smoke from this fuel had a specific but not acrid aroma, which became the smell of home for many generations of plains dwellers. It was an environmentally friendly and effective solution to the energy problem. The second most important fuel in the steppe was dry grass, twisted into tight bundles. Grass simply thrown into the fire burned instantly, giving only a flash, but dense bundles burned longer and hotter. Such grass logs were prepared in advance using the tough stems of steppe plants. This required time and effort, but it allowed the fire to be maintained where there were no bison. Grass fires required constant attention and the addition of new bundles. Large animal bones left over from hunting and meals were also used. Bones rich in fat and marrow burned very hot, producing high temperatures, but gave off an unpleasant smoke. Bone fires were mainly used outdoors for technical needs, or when no other fuel was available. It was a last resort fuel, but it saved lives in the harshest winters. The fat inside the bones acted as a natural wax in a candle. In river valleys, people collected driftwood, wood that had been washed ashore and dried by the sun. This material was worth its weight in gold and was used sparingly, often only for kindling or special ritual fires. Driftwood burned cleanly and brightly, but its supply was limited and quickly depleted when a large camp passed through. Therefore, the tribes tried not to stay in one place for too long so as not to deplete resources. Migration routes were planned, taking into account the availability of not only water and game, but also fuel. In winter, when everything was hidden under snow, the search for fuel became a real test of observation. The Indians looked for places where the wind blew the snow away, exposing the ground with the coveted chips or dry grass. They also used shrubs growing in ravines, digging them up along with their roots. The roots of the shrubs, dense and gnarled, burned for a long time and produced good coals. It was hard work, but it ensured survival. Interestingly, fuel was treated with extreme care. Not a single splinter or piece of bark was thrown away. Even the ashes from the fires were used in everyday life. They were used for tanning hides, as a cleaning agent, or as a food additive. Waste-free production was the norm in conditions of resource scarcity. Fuel economy was woven into the cultural code of the people. Life on the plains taught people to see energy in the most unexpected forms of matter. They did not complain about the lack of forests, but adapted to the environment, finding effective substitutes for the usual firewood. Steppe coal became a symbol of ingenuity and the ability to survive in any conditions. Understanding the energy potential of their environment made the Indians true masters of their land. They could keep warm where Europeans froze, seeing nothing but grass and earth around them. Next, we will talk about how the first spark was born. What if everything you've been taught about rubbing sticks together is hopelessly outdated? We're used to seeing movies where the hero furiously rubs a stick between his palms and gets fire in a minute. In reality, especially in wet and cold weather, this method requires not so much strength as a deep knowledge of materials and technique. Native Americans used the bow drill and hand drill methods, but the secret to success lay in details invisible to the untrained eye. The main nuance was the correct selection of a pair of wood, the drill and the base, plank. They could not be from the same piece of wood. The ideal combination was considered to be a harder drill and a softer base. For example, a drill made of hard yucca and a base made of soft poplar or cedar root. This combination provided the right friction, in which the base was ground into hot black powder and the drill remained intact. Knowledge of the compatibility of wood species was akin to knowledge of chemistry. The process of obtaining fire itself resembled a sacred ritual where every movement was calibrated by years of practice. The master had to maintain constant pressure and speed without stopping for a second so as not to lose the accumulated heat. In high humidity conditions, this was critically difficult as the wood absorbed moisture from the air. Therefore, fire tools were carried under clothing, closer to the body, keeping them dry and warm. Attempting to make fire with cold and damp tools was doomed to failure. The second secret was charcoal powder, black dust formed by friction. It was this powder that, when heated to a critical temperature, produced a tiny smoldering ember. The Indians placed a piece of bark or leather under the board to collect this precious dust and prevent it from cooling on the cold ground. One awkward movement could scatter the result of half an hour's effort. This moment required extreme concentration and accuracy. The bow drill significantly increased the speed of rotation and pressure, saving human energy. The bowstring, made of rawhide, wrapped around the drill, causing it to rotate at a furious speed. The upper stop, often made of stone or bone with a recess, was lubricated with grease to reduce friction where it was not needed. It was a real mechanical machine that could be carried in your pocket. The efficiency of this method was many times higher than that of simple rotation with the palms. However, some tribes, especially in desert regions, preferred a hand drill, a long, thin rod that was rotated by quickly moving the palms up and down. This method required calloused hands and tremendous endurance, but it allowed the process to be felt with the fingertips. Masters of the hand drill could produce charcoal in less than a minute if the materials were dry. This was considered a sign of supreme skill and masculine strength. The most important element was the creation of a nest of tinder into which the newly formed coal was placed. The nest was made of the softest dry grass, fluffed juniper bark, or plant down. The coal was carefully transferred to the center of the nest, covered and then blown on. The breath had to be steady and long to saturate the coal with oxygen, but not blow away the heat. This was the moment of truth. Would the spark turn into a living flame? Training in these skills began in early childhood, through games and imitation of adults. Children competed to see who could get smoke faster, learning the properties of wood through tactile experience. By the time they reached adulthood, every young man knew the taste and smell of the right wood for fire. A mistake in choosing the wrong material in a real situation could cost a life. Making fire by friction is not just physical labor. It is a demonstration of man's power over matter. The transformation of cold wood into a burning fire seemed like a miracle to anyone who saw it for the first time. In the next chapter, you will learn how they dealt with wood that seemed impossible to ignite. When it rains for weeks and the forest is soaked through, it seems impossible to build a proper fire. Moisture penetrates the bark, saturates the upper layers of the wood, and an ordinary branch only hisses and smokes, refusing to burn. However, Native Americans knew that water rarely penetrates to the very depths of thick logs and trunks. The art of working with wet wood lay in the ability to reach the dry core hidden inside. The main tools in such situations were a wedge in a stone or a sturdy knife if available. The trunk of a dead but standing tree, even if it was wet on the outside, was split along the grain. The inside, the core, almost always remained dry and suitable for burning. Thin shavings known as fire feathers were cut from this dry center, which ignited easily. This required physical effort, but guaranteed results. Another important tactic was to use the fire itself to dry the next batch of fuel. Wet logs were placed around the hearth at a safe distance, creating a kind of well or wall. The heat from the fire evaporated the moisture from the wood, and by the time it was necessary to add more wood, it was already dry. This continuous drying process allowed the fire to be maintained even in heavy rain, using fuel that was initially unsuitable. The Indians also knew about the properties of some types of wood to burn even when wet. For example, yellow birch or some types of ash contain enough oils to maintain combustion even at high humidity. These trees were especially valued and used as a starter for a large fire. Knowledge of botany allowed them to choose the right trees in the forest, saving time on kindling. To protect the fire from falling raindrops, temporary shelters were built from bark or branches located high above the flames. This created a dry area directly around the hearth where small kindling could be dried. It was important not to make the canopy too low so that it would not catch fire from sparks. Such structures were erected quickly and served as a reliable umbrella for the fire. During combustion, wet wood releases a lot of steam and smoke, which lowers the temperature of the flames. To compensate for this, the fire was made denser and more compact, keeping the heat inside the stack. The coals were raked into a pile and covered with fresh wood so that the heat was concentrated in the center. This thermal pit allowed even very wet branches to be dried and burned. Another technique was to split the ends of the branches before throwing them into the fire. Split wood has a larger surface area and dries faster when exposed to heat. This significantly accelerated the process of igniting wet wood. Every detail of fuel preparation was aimed at combating moisture. Experienced survivalists never placed wood directly on wet ground. They always created a platform of bark or stones, isolating the future fire from the damp soil. This prevented heat loss and moisture absorption from below. The foundation of the fire was as important as the fuel itself. With the arrival of Europeans, the methods of fire making among indigenous peoples began to change rapidly, although the old ways were not forgotten. Trade brought steel flints to the continent, which when combined with hard flint, produced an abundant shower of hot sparks. This method was much faster and more reliable in wet weather than rubbing wooden sticks together, and was therefore adopted by the Indians with great enthusiasm. The steel flint became one of the most sought-after commodities in trade between tribes and merchants. The principle of operation was simple. A sharp blow of a steel plate against the sharp edge of flint carved out microscopic particles of red-hot metal. These particles, having the burning temperature of iron, fell on prepared tinder and instantly ignited it. The main advantage was that steel and stone were not as susceptible to moisture as wooden tools. Even if the flint fell into water, it was enough to wipe it dry, and it was ready to work again. The Indians quickly adapted the new tools to their traditional materials. They continued to use the familiar tinder fungus or charred cotton cloth, which appeared with trade as tinder. The combination of European steel and local natural knowledge created an incredibly effective system. Fire kits were stored in beautiful leather pouches, often decorated with beads and worn on the belt as an important accessory. An unusual type of flint was the so-called striker, which was often made from old files or broken knife blades. Blacksmiths forged high-carbon steel into convenient shapes, ovals, horseshoes, or curved brackets that fit comfortably in the hand, often on 2 to 3 fingers. Native American craftsmen also learned to work with metal, creating their own unique forms of strikers. Each striker was unique and valued by its owner. Despite the popularity of steel, flint remained an essential component that had to be sought out in nature. Knowledge of the locations of high-quality flint or chalcedony deposits was still relevant. The stone had to be hard enough to scratch the steel and chip off to form a sharp cutting edge. A dull stone produced few sparks, so it was regularly sharpened or replaced. The process of obtaining fire with a flint required different motor skills than friction, but the Indians mastered it with virtuosity. An experienced person could strike fire in a couple of seconds, directing the spark precisely to the center of the tinder with one accurate blow. This saved precious time at campsites and on hikes. The speed of obtaining fire became a new standard of living. However, the old methods of friction did not disappear completely, but became ritual or backup methods. During sacred ceremonies, fire was often obtained in a pure way by friction as bequeathed by the ancestors, who considered steel to be an object from another world. But in everyday life, pragmatism prevailed. and the clang of steel against stone became a familiar sound in the evening camp. This was an example of successful technological adaptation. Flint sets often became objects of pride and gifts. A good flint, producing a thick shower of sparks, could cost several beaver skins or a good horse. It was an investment in daily comfort and safety. Trade routes carried these tools to the most remote corners of the continent. In the culture of the Iroquois and other peoples of the Northeast who lived in huge wooden structures called longhouses, fire management had its own specifics. Up to 20 families could live in one such house, and inside there were many fires burning in a row along the central axis of the building. The task of maintaining the fire here was not only related to warmth, but also to smoke management in a confined space. It was a complex system of collective life support. Each hearth usually served two families living opposite each other in compartments along the walls. The fire was used for cooking, lighting, and heating, but it also created problems with smoke. To allow the smoke to escape, holes were made in the roof, covered with movable pieces of bark. Those on duty had to adjust the position of these flaps, depending on the direction of the wind, to create draft and keep rain or snow out. Firewood for longhouses was harvested on an industrial scale by the entire community. Huge wood piles were stacked at the entrances and inside the house so that the wood could dry before use. Hardwoods such as maple, oak, and hickory were mainly used, as they produced a lot of heat and less smoke than softwoods. Choosing the right fuel was a matter of comfort for dozens of people living under one roof. The central fires burned almost around the clock, especially in winter. At night, they were put to sleep by covering them with a thick layer of ash so that the coals could be quickly stoked in the morning. The complete extinction of the fire in the house was considered a bad sign and a sign of mismanagement. The heat from the many hearths was accumulated by the walls and objects, creating a microclimate inside that was significantly different from that outside. The space above the fires was used to dry herbs, corn, meat, and clothing. The smoke acted as a preservative, protecting the products from spoilage and insects. The high arches of the longhouse allowed the smoke to accumulate at the top without disturbing the people below, provided that the ventilation worked properly. This was a clever use of vertical zoning. Life in a longhouse required strict discipline in handling fire. Any spark that fell on dry mats or bark walls could lead to an instant fire, destroying the house and all the clan's property. Therefore, the fire was constantly monitored, and children learned fire safety rules from an early age. Fire was a common friend, but also a common threat. Fire occupied a central place in the ritual life of the Iroquois. There were ceremonies of the white dog and the renewal of fire, when all the hearths in the village were extinguished and then rekindled from a single sacred fire. This symbolized the purification and unity of the people. Fire bound families into a single social organism. Subarctic peoples, such as the Cree and Athabascans, lived in conditions where winter lasted most of the year and temperatures reached extreme lows. Their fire-making techniques were perfected because a mistake here could cost a life faster than anywhere else. One of the main problems was deep snow, which could reach several meters. Building a fire in such conditions required a special floating fire strategy. Instead of digging through the snow to the ground, which was laborious and not always possible, hunters built a platform out of green, damp logs. These logs served as a foundation on which to build a fire. As the fire burned, the platform slowly charred, but did not burn completely, retaining the heat above the snow. If the fire began to sink, a new layer of platform was simply added on top. This allowed the fire to remain on the surface of the snowy ocean. Another important technique was the night fire, or nodya. Although this is a Siberian term, the principle was similar among all northern peoples. 2 or 3 long logs were stacked on top of each other or laid parallel, and set alight along their entire length. Such a fire burned for a very long time, up to 8 to 10 hours, providing even heat to the person sleeping nearby. There was no need to jump up every hour to throw on more branches. This was the only way to get a good night's sleep in the cold without shelter. The northern Indians used the smallest dry twigs at the bottom of the spruce trees, which always remained dry, to light the fire. They formed them into a dense ball, inside which they placed tinder. This ball was raised to eye level and blown on so as not to lean over the cold snow and to use the wind as an aid. The technique of working with your hands in the cold had to be lightning fast so as not to freeze your fingers. Clothes and equipment were dried by the fire with special care. Wet leather shoes could shrink and become rock hard when dried quickly, making them unsuitable for wear. Therefore, items were dried slowly, at a distance, constantly checking them by touch. The ability to dry moccasins properly was as important as the ability to obtain food. Snow pits or shelters that reflected the heat of the fire were often used as temporary shelters. Snow, being an excellent insulator, helped to retain heat if used correctly. The walls of the snow pit melted from the fire, forming an icy crust that reflected heat even better. The result was a cozy microcapsule in the middle of an icy desert. Preparing firewood in the subarctic was a constant background process. Moving on snowshoes, the hunter automatically noted dry trees that could be easily felled. An axe or heavy knife were the main tools for survival. Without tools, it was almost impossible to obtain frozen wood. Special attention was paid to protecting the hands. All operations with a flint or friction were performed with thin gloves or sleeves so that the skin did not touch the icy metal or stone. Loss of sensitivity in the fingers meant the inability to light a fire, which led to death. It was a constant struggle to maintain body heat. We have seen that for the indigenous peoples of America, fire-making was not just a domestic skill, but a whole science, philosophy, and art honed over millennia. From hidden tinder reserves in wet forests to the engineering marvels of the Dakota hearth in portable charcoal containers, each solution was an ingenious response to the challenges of the harsh, natural environment. They did not fight the elements with brute force, but used a deep understanding of their laws to turn a hostile environment into their home. This knowledge proves that observation and ingenuity can keep you warm even in the most bitter cold. Which method did you find most surprising? Carrying fire in mushrooms or building a fire on a floating platform in the snow? Write in the comments which topic from Native American life you would like to explore in future videos. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss out on new stories about survival and traditions of the past.